Hello there, viewers, and welcome to this Rainbird mini webinar on fraud entitled Catch Me If You Can, How to Keep Up with a Changing Fraud Landscape. My name is Robin Young. I'll be your host, and with me today is Ed Beechman from our fraud and banking team.
Hi everyone, excited to be here.
As usual, we will be recording this webinar and making it available to you after the presentation. Details of this will follow via email. If you have any questions, please add them to the questions box provided, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. So without further ado, here's Ed to take you through it.
Thanks very much, Robin. As mentioned, catch me if you can, how to keep up with a changing fraud landscape. Now, I'm going to start not by going too much into the statistics. As industry professionals, you would have been exposed to big numbers day in, day out. But there are some numbers to showcase the landscape at the present time. 1.2 billion was lost last year through fraud and scams, which is a 16% increase from 2017. Now, the pie chart at the bottom shows that payment card and authorized payments still account for 86%. But it's the table above that I actually find really interesting. As you can see, there's no real constant trend going on. And one of the main fraud types, card ID theft, rose by 119% last year, which shows that actually spotting trends and patterns is quite hard to predict in the data. Now, the main driver of card ID theft was application fraud, which is when fraudsters, they can open your account using stolen information, such as utility bills and proof of address. And the intelligence propping this up suggests that it's due to an increase in data harvesting and customer digital usage, which makes total sense to me. I mean, personally, I have gone paperless. I no longer get financial statements in the post. I've moved house a few times in the past few years, and I actually have no idea what address is on file at my bank. So things such as AVS, or address verification services, are being made redundant as application fraud spikes. So I suppose the theme here is that the only notion we can count on is that year on year fraud is rising. And what is the cost of that fraud? You have the visible costs, the things that come to mind, the chargebacks, the manual reviews and the forensics needed in the investigation, any fines that might be imposed from data breaches, and obviously the legal costs of pursuing a criminal. But what you also have is this massive, overwhelming hidden costs, such as wasted labor from time spent investigating fraudulent activity that should have been dealt with at the first line of defense. You have unreliable financial data as your customer data is skewed by fraudulent activity. There's a statistic here that says 40% of customers actually move cards to the back of their wallet if their card's been blocked. And obviously brand reputation is at risk. Now, the mission of the day, and I suppose the driving principle of this webinar, is looking at how banks and financial institutions can create this seamless customer journey that's without friction, without frustration, and where convenience is king. And the figures reflect this trend, with EY saying 70% of adults now use online banking. There's 5.5 billion logins to banking apps, which is a 13% rise from the year before. However, with all these touch points come more blind spots. Mobile apps are absolutely ripe targets for attacks. They have non-encrypted chat communication, they have the possibility of overlay assaults, and there's always penetration in app design, creating a thin balancing act between user experience that drives features and ultimately growth for the institutions versus the security components. So it's a very tough line to tread. Which brings us to the big dilemma, which is the innovation versus security debate. So banks have to cater for this demand of convenience without jeopardizing their customers or even annoying them with poor service. But what we find is, as banks release more features, fraudsters are often the first ones to act. They're monitoring new product releases, beta releases, and press launches for weaknesses and vulnerabilities. So innovation to entice customers to the company often actually expose them further to fraudsters. Which brings us on to what are we actually looking for from the fraud systems? I mean, we saw from our earlier statistics the fluctuating methodology of fraud, with perpetrators being more agile and inventive than the banks. Fraud systems, it seems, are being tasked to keep up with today's criminals, but are constantly having the goalposts moved. Fraud attacks appearing in new and unexpected spots. Essentially, we can't have this binary, one-size-fits-all sense of security. Rather, we need systems based on the propensity of risk in every specific circumstance. Essentially, real-time fraud detection needs to constantly reduce risk exposure in a tailored manner with risk parameters being shifted based on each customer profile. Now, the knock-on effect of what this will have is it will instill trust in the channel by the consumer, and thus there'll be more use and more spending. Now, going a little bit more granular into the key functionalities that you want to be looking out for. First of all, it's the relevant and consistent fraud investigation and spotting techniques that's key. Now, the trend you often see is you have an increase in fraud, and that's mirrored by an increase in headcount. Fin crime personnel, they equate for about 3% of the bank's headcount now, and that figure's actually doubled in the last 6 years. However, people often say that offshore teams are costly, they're error prone, and they take a long time to train up. So here at Rainbird, we feel that rather than a scaling of human resources, we should really be considering a scaling of human knowledge via technology. Something that can effectively replicate, en masse, the intricacies of human decision making, allowing best practice to always be the first line of defense. Now, this in turn means that any system needs to be human-led rather than data-led. Now, data can be misleading from past fraudulent transactions, and the earlier table shows that historic data can't always predict or even stop future fluctuations of fraud type. What's more is that we live in this world of interchangeable financial services institutions. We can easily open new accounts with incredible speed and ease, meaning banks are lacking in usable background data for appropriate risk profiling. So at Rainbird, we believe that fraud systems need to be human-led rather than data-led. You need to base your system on your own company's fraud expertise, meaning that you encode your personal logic into the system, essentially teaching the system about the different types of fraud, so that even in the absence of data, it can come to a decision. Now, nuanced logic rather than binary RPA tools. Now, this is often where many companies can be slightly misled, as they opt for an investigation tool that has a catch-all policy over a specific tailored approach. And what you end up with is this long tail of more complicated edge cases that linear automation systems just can't decipher. And then you have a need to defer back to the human, which ultimately results in more blocked cards and a longer latency period for solving these fraud issues. So there is this need for a bespoke and a risk-appropriate approach, rather than a if this then that linear system, which flows up quite a few red flags. So things such as weightings, confidency factors, and the ability to perform judgments in the absence of data all need to be central to an effective tool. And finally, configurable, scalable, and adaptable. So every company's fraud profile is unique. A tailored approach to fraud prevention is therefore key. And this means investing in a platform that is configurable to your company, scalable across not only multiple channels, but in the number of transactions it can handle, and is easily adjustable so as to effectively identify and deal with any new fraud types without simply pulling products or suffering major losses. And this kind of brings us to the question of who guards the guards? We need to hold these systems, these methodologies to account. We need to be able to provide information to the regulators and to our customers to show that we are doing the utmost to protect them. And most importantly, we need to understand the rationale of how and why these decisions were made. If you add to that the introduction of these new regulatory frameworks that center around an ethical and explainable approach to automation, it's crucial that any new fraud process has to be explainable to the regulator and the consumer alike. Trust and transparency has climbed to the top of anyone's priority pile. Now, on the compliance side, financial institutions need to be prepared to explain their models, how they work, and explain the decisions to avoid any potential breaches and fines. On the front-facing side, customers really do crave transparency. They want informed interactions, not just a computer says no or an unaccountable decision. Because of that, rules-based models are going to become crucially important. Not only are they able to scale expertise effectively, but they can also offer a level of accessible and affordable auditability that is simply absent in competing technologies. Now, if you indulge me, I'm just going to speak a little bit about the Rainbird fraud prevention system. It's currently live in 2 high street banks and a credit card company, mainly because of its highly tailored and human-centric approach. So Rainbird projects, they always start with the expert, which is you. Understanding what factors and data go into a decision around fraud. We model that specialist knowledge into our platform, either using our graphical interface or by our easy-to-use code base. We connect it to the relevant data sources needed to provide an informed decision, and Rainbird, to a percentage level of confidence, can give you a decision. Ultimately, what this leaves you with is a scalable, omni-channel, bespoke tool that can emulate the thinking of your best fraud worker. What's more, Rainbird is entirely explainable, with every and all decisions it makes having an inbuilt audit trail, which you can see on screen now. This means a transparent, a trustworthy, and a compliant system that's sitting at the core of all your investigation techniques. Finally, it's incredibly easy to use, update, and add additional investigation techniques as different types of fraud arise in the circumstance. So to conclude, as we've seen from the earlier statistics, fraud is constantly changing and increasingly difficult to predict. Scaling up your expert knowledge, rather than relying on historic data or linear if this then that models, is the best way to capture those more difficult edge cases and reduce friction for the customer, which will essentially find that sweet spot between convenience and security, while remaining fully accountable to customers and regulators. Thank you very much. I welcome some questions on this. And if you want to get in contact with me further, you can email me at edward.beecham@rainbird.ai.
Thank you very much for that, Ed. That's certainly given me food for thought, certainly about my mobile banking situation. There's some things in there that actually gave me a little bit of chills. But we think we've got a couple of questions from the viewers here. The first one, I think if I'm saying it correctly, is can you talk a bit more about the previous implementations and success stories of Rainbird tackling fraud?
Absolutely, good question. Let us take that in two parts. So the way an implementation works is that Rainbird always starts any project by sitting down with the experts in the company. So in this case, it would be the fraud handlers or the fraud investigation team. Over a 6 to 8 week period, we then model the techniques, the logic, the expertise, I suppose, that's almost entrapped in your best fraud workers. And we put that to our platform, we put that to our engineers, and we build out that. There's a serious level of testing that goes down. And fundamentally, what you're left with is a rule set that can be signed off by upper management that gives you an accurate and consistent performance every single time. Now, talking about some success stories, I mentioned the high street banks, and we've done work with a credit card company as well. I'll touch on one of them, which was the fraud investigation, although we also did work on fraud dispute and claim handling. In the investigation scenario, we actually ended up automating 85% of cases, which resulted in a 60% reduction in back office processing costs. Now, what's important to note is that we're not trying to automate 100% of the cases. We understand that there are always going to be certain elements that will require some human judgment. But if we can remove the low-hanging fruit and free up your employees' time to do the more complex stuff, that's exactly what we're here for, and that's exactly what we have been able to do.
Excellent. That makes an awful lot of sense. We've got another question here, which is a bit blunt, but why not take a data-led approach?
Yeah, so maybe again, backing up would be good. Rainbird, although I talked a lot about how we're human first, data second, that is not to say that data isn't an integral and almost vital part of the decisioning process. Data gives Rainbird the contextual knowledge from which it can make a decision from. So it's actually key. It's crucial to Rainbird to actually have that information either on an external system like credit score ratings or a company's house, for instance, or your internal customer relationship management systems. So data is key as a kind of a starting point. But in terms of a data-led approach, you hear statistics from companies like Accenture that says 97% of business decisions made using data, the company's own managers don't consider it to be of acceptable quality. So this kind of element of unreliable data, coupled with the fact that if you're using data analytics or even machine learning techniques, you do lose that level of transparency I spoke about earlier, which is going to become more and more of an important factor as we kind of move forward into these new frameworks. So whilst data is crucial, we still think that the human-led approach is more appropriate and sufficient in this circumstance.
Great. Okay, so we've limited this webinar to a 20-minute session. Although there are other questions that have come through, what we're going to do is we're going to answer those offline instead. Now, thank you very much for joining us. As I said before, just to remind you, we have been recording this webinar and we will make it available to you afterwards via email. As I said before, all the questions that we didn't manage to answer today, we'll answer afterwards via email as well. So thank you very much for joining. My name's been Robin Young. I've been the host, and also thanks to Ed Beechman for talking us through fraud.
Thank you very much, guys. Have a good day.